In the 1950s, water in a newly built lake disappeared overnight. In the 1970s, a sewage lagoon collapsed, polluting area groundwater and sickening hundreds. In the 1980s, a fertilizer pipeline break released chemicals that killed thousands of fish and cave creatures in a big spring. Then, in 2006, a sinkhole developed abruptly, and a garage and car fell in.
The common thread of these dramatic events, they all took place in the Ozarks, but more importantly, they all involved karst, that misunderstood mix of water and rock that is the basis for the Ozarks' caves, springs, sinkholes, and its losing streams, where surface water vanishes. These dramas all involve structures that people had built, some unsuspecting, some knowing the risks, in a land full of holes where rivers can run underground. What follows is a glimpse into dramatic interactions in recent decades between people, their structures, and the Ozark landscape.
I walked out there to get a picture of that sinkhole at the bottom.
Geologist Jim Van Dyke investigated karst groundwater contamination during his 33-year career.
Karst is what you find in areas where you have a soluble rock. Rainwater contains enough carbon dioxide that it forms a weak solution of carbonic acid, and when it comes in contact with the rock, it slowly dissolves it. As the openings get larger and larger, more and more water can drain through them.
Rainwater flowing through these rock openings can move fast, with no time to filter sediment, chemicals, or harmful bacteria. Karst areas are very common throughout the Ozarks, but it's deeply developed in south-central Missouri, where our dramas occur. The Osage, who lived in Missouri prior to the 1800s, considered certain caves and springs to be sacred places. As European Americans moved into the Ozarks, initially they didn't recognize the relationship between surface water, groundwater, and springs. In the early 1800s, some residents drained household waste directly into sinkholes. In south-central Missouri, home to the Ozarks' biggest springs, the need for clean water and water power led to settlements near springs and streams. By the 1900s, towns built in karst areas were well established, with railroads, hospitals, municipal wells, and city dumps. But some of these were in sinkholes. Towns abandoned sinkhole dumping when dye traces connected the dumps with popular springs. Karst dramas escalated as more structures were built in the Ozarks, like houses, schools, roads, and lakes. In the late 1950s, a foreboding preview of karst dramas to come unfolded at the Dean Davis Conservation Area, just north of Pomona, Missouri.
Behind me, this beautiful valley, a losing stream valley, was filled with water. It was a newly constructed lake, but unfortunately, a sinkhole developed in the bottom of the lake and the water drained overnight. According to local lore, the ground rumbled and shook as the water made its way to Greer Spring.
They were never able to seal the lake, and ever since, it only holds water in this small pond.
In 1964, in nearby West Plains, Missouri, as population grew, water usage outpaced the capacity of the city's sewage treatment plant. So, city officials decided to build a sewage lagoon. And they built it right here in this wide bottomland next to Howell Creek, which is a losing stream.
From about Pomona, a few miles, to Maramec Spring is an area of very intense karst development. And there's lots of sinkholes, lots of disappearing streams.
A state geologist had told city planners that porous bedrock at their lagoon site could contaminate groundwater, but they didn't know the valley had a cave running underneath it. After the 60-acre sewage lagoon was built, a couple of leaks developed in the 1960s that were plugged without fanfare. But otherwise, it held up until May 1978, when a sinkhole developed. 2 more sinkholes appeared a few days later, and these formed whirlpools that sucked down the foul sewage like draining a bathtub. Polluted water coursed through underground tubes and tunnels, turning local well water green. After the lagoon drained, 2 big holes could be seen. The thick gray layer is sewage sludge.
There were reports of foul-smelling water and so forth.
The collapse of the lagoons, it was a really, really big deal for this area.
There was nothing on the news except that spill for days and days and days.
The governor called in the National Guard to dispense drinking water to rural residents with polluted wells.
I was 19 years old. I just not too far out of high school. I was playing baseball in South Fork. I was down there, and the National Guard had a water truck parked out in front of the school. You know, it's hot, sweating, gotta have water. So I assumed any water around would have come from that water tank. Obviously, I drank some water from somebody's water jug, and come to find out they'd brought it from home. I got deathly ill. It was probably the most miserable time that I've ever had in my life, before or since.
The health department recorded more than 800 illnesses associated with the lagoon collapse.
It was a situation where the lagoon was probably placed in some place that had not to have been in the first place. But the laws were not strict enough at that time to basically say, no, you can't put it there. When it failed catastrophically. It drained 50 to 60 million gallons of sewage directly into the groundwater system. A geologist from the State Geological Survey injected fluorescein dye into the water disappearing into the ground. That dye was later recovered at Maramec Spring in northern Arkansas.
An army of dump trucks was called in to fill the holes in the lagoon. West Plains received emergency funding from the EPA to build a state-of-the-art sewage treatment plant.
After this treatment plant was built, the lagoons were filled in, graded out, and sown with grass.
Nowadays, cattle graze at the former lagoon site. Discharge from the sewage treatment plant flows into Howell Creek right here.
That water from its initial state of raw sewage will be reduced by 98 to 99%. So it's really pretty clean water. A couple miles down this creek, there's not any water. It's a dry hole. As soon as it hits Howell Creek, it starts percolating down through the ground and into the water system. But you can't just dump stuff out into a creek thinking it'll purify so many miles down the creek. That's not the way it works. In a losing stream, it immediately starts going into the ground.
After the West Plains Sewage Lagoon collapse, a lot more attention was given to doing geologic evaluations, trying to make sure that this didn't happen again in other places. And so lagoon sites were being carefully evaluated for collapse potential by the State Geological Survey.
Within a few years, several nearby towns in karst areas retired their risky lagoons and built new sewage treatment plants.
Since the 1978 collapse, to the best of my knowledge, there haven't been any repeat incidents as far as wastewater lagoons in the Ozarks.
There are other risks with Ozark Karst than just ponds or lakes or lagoons giving way under the weight of water. Our Ozark soil is so thin and porous that just about anything on the surface can make its way underground. Therefore, if there's any kind of an accident, say a truck carrying chemicals has a spill, or an underground gasoline storage tank is leaking, or a pipeline ruptures, any of these things can put contaminants straight underground and pollute the groundwater. And this is especially a concern if the accident takes place close to a sinkhole or a losing stream like we have here.
In 1981, the park naturalist at Maramec Spring saw something very unusual.
I had been walking around the spring and I noticed we were having large numbers of red-shouldered hawks and barred owls hanging around the head of the spring, which was very unusual.
And they were just lined up in here and they were coming in to feed on the trout. The trout were an easy target because they're sticking their heads out of the water to breathe. And then we realized that, hey, there was a real problem here.
In November of 1981, there was a leak from a pipeline that carries ammonium nitrate and urea fertilizer from Oklahoma to Illinois, passes through parts of Phelps County. It was not a big rupture, but the pressure in the pipeline was a couple of hundred PSI, and it went into a creek called Dry Fork. Now, in the Ozarks, whenever you have a creek that's called dry anything, most often it's going to be a losing stream.
The fertilizer reached the spring in about 12 days. Maramec Spring, the fifth largest in Missouri, emerges from a well-developed cave system. It's in a privately owned park, and its water supplies a fish hatchery that raises thousands of trout.
Fertilizers, the ammonium nitrate and the urea, they have a high chemical oxygen demand. It takes oxygen out of the water.
Once the ammonium nitrate had depleted the oxygen, all these animals start coming out in droves, trying to breathe. So the rainbow trout were sticking their heads above the water, gulping air.
These fish were the easy target that the hawks and owls were feasting upon. Hundreds of trout in the nearby fish hatchery were at risk. The big trout swam downstream, but the small ones were captive in pools.
The fingerling trout were kept alive by putting large pumps next to the spring, pumping the water up into the air and aerating it, and there was about 800 to 900 pounds of trout did die.
Also dying were the rare cave creatures that lived in the dark, deep within the waters of Maramec Spring Cave. When oxygen levels reached nearly zero, they started emerging into the spring pool. The entire population was dying, but
we salvaged hundreds and hundreds of crayfish, the cavefish, and the salamanders. Well, most of them came up on their own looking for air, so you could catch them real quick with a dip net. The crayfish were walking along the banks. You could just grab them with your fingers, and it got to be so overwhelming, and we had such large quantities, we had to send them to other places. I had hundreds of them here that we were keeping alive.
It took 7 weeks for the spring water to become safe for fish, and then the animals were returned to their original habitat.
It was a very bad situation. But one of the upsides was we got to see these animals and study them and get an idea of what actually went on down inside the dark cave. We had no idea the amount of animals that ecosystem down there could sustain. The effect that ammonia pipeline had on the spring was devastating. It wiped out, I would say, thousands and thousands of animals that call that home. I hope that this never happens again.
In 1998, karst troubles again hit water supplies here in West Plains. The city wells were pumping cloudy, turbid water filled with red clay particles. People complained. They were getting orange ice cubes.
My wife, she pulled her hair out more than once, put white clothes in to wash, and they would come out orange.
It seems so mystifying. How could deep city wells, some of them drilled to 1,500 feet, how could they be so dirty?
There's an area of very intense karst development from about Pomona, north of West Plains, to Maramec Spring area. Almost all the streams are going to be losing streams and lots of large sinkholes.
During a big rain, water goes straight underground into a conduit system, basically water-filled caves with no filtering, carrying sediment and contaminants underground.
And that is one of the things that's very characteristic in the West Plains area, that staining and mud pockets and so forth at considerable depth in these municipal wells.
So, city wells here are cased very deep, some even to 1,000 feet.
And even still, at 1,000 foot, they would produce water at times that contained bacteria, and which is almost unheard of.
Even in early 80s, occasionally we would get muddy water, but it didn't last long. In the 90s, West Plains grew, and with growth comes land disturbance. And we were knocking hilltops off, flattening out ground, and exposing red clay. And when it rained, it would make its way to our deep wells.
West Plains ended up building a water treatment plant.
Its primary purpose is just removing the turbidity or mud from the water. If we did not have a treatment facility, everybody would have orange water today.
Lakes and lagoons failing, pipelines bursting, or wells turning muddy. These are not the only risks when we build in karst areas. Whoa, look at that. If a sinkhole opens in the wrong spot, it's trouble.
In the town of Nixa, a gentleman, Mr. Scrivener, was in his house one day. And all of a sudden, he started hearing this terrible noise, felt the house shaking, and his initial thought, he told me, was a tornado, except there was no storms in the forecast and there was sunshine and blue sky outside. He went in the direction of where the noise was, and which was towards the garage. He noticed the floor of the house was tilting downward. A large sinkhole had opened up beneath his garage, and basically the entire garage had disappeared into the sinkhole. Material and dirt and such had collapsed in on top of that, so you couldn't even see the remains of the garage. It literally destroyed the house. Now, this is fairly unusual. Most of the time, sinkhole collapses are off out in the country somewhere, and they don't really do that much property damage.
Poor drainage can be a factor when sinkholes form near structures, particularly if water isn't diverted away from the foundation. News reports widely publicized the rare Nixa sinkhole.
He was much more philosophical after he found that his insurance did cover sinkhole damage. The city ended up buying the property, and the house was torn down, and then the sinkhole was filled just basically as a vacant lot.
Only a year later, something startling happened at this school.
In September of '07, we came to work one Monday morning. The middle school principal discovered that we had an opening or a void that had developed under the foundation of the middle school wing of the building. The void at that point was about 2.5 to 3 foot across, about 6.5 foot deep.
Gutters and downspouts had not been maintained right next to this classroom, and so water pooled in this corner, and it caused erosion underground as it drained.
We didn't allow students into that wing because we didn't know whether that building was safe or not.
With the Nixa house fresh in their memories, parents worried about further collapse. Some kept their kids home for days, even after an engineer determined that most of the middle school was safe.
We decided to not put students back into 2 classrooms. We put them in the library for the whole year.
The engineer arranged for concrete piers to be installed to protect the building in case the sinkhole developed further.
As we drill down to a confident rock or to bedrock, and we pump a grout back up through this, which makes a grout column. That's all locked into the footing, which in turn shifts the load from the ground around it down to the depth of the pier. That's basically what holds up your school.
This was the first sinkhole reported among nearly 500 schools that the company insured. However, the foundation repair was not covered because the building itself was not damaged.
14 of the 23 planned piers were installed, but problems developed.
These rods are not strong enough to withstand going any deeper than 70 foot.
At the spot right at the sinkhole, the bedrock was too deep to install a pier.
We've reached depths of 150 feet at this point.
The contractor withdrew the warranty essentially condemning 3 classrooms in that wing of the building. All work stopped, and the job was never completed.
In the years since, the foundation and walls in this building have not moved at all, but 3 classrooms are still condemned.
This is one of 3 classrooms that is currently off limits to students. Now we just use it for storage.
Loss of 3 classrooms made space problems worse in an already overcrowded building. The solution? In 2008, voters passed a bond issue for construction of a new middle school, which was built with an oversized, sinkhole-resistant foundation. Underground drains were installed at the old building to channel water away from the problem area.
So, right here was the sinkhole that built a school.
Having a sinkhole open up right under their classroom is offered, you talk about teaching to the moment. It's offered a prime moment for talking and teaching about karst topography, which will affect our students, those that stay here their entire lives, because this whole area is karst topography and caves and springs, and so it gave them an up-close view of what can happen with a sinkhole.
If time allowed, we could tell more karst stories, such as Jam Up Cave's roof falling in, or when manure from a dairy lagoon washed into a nearby losing stream and a neighbor complained of brown, smelly water in her well, or a big drama in Perry County where a controversy developed when the grotto sculpin, a rare cave-dwelling fish, was threatened by pollution. Hear how the community resolved this in the documentary Karst in Perry County.
As we've seen, when you build things in risky places, sometimes bad things happen. In the Ozarks, chemicals have killed fish, lakes and lagoons have drained overnight, sewage has sickened hundreds, and one garage was swallowed by a sinkhole.
Early residents were attracted to the Ozarks' clear, abundant water. Springs and float streams are still big attractions. But with more people, development follows, and this land still sits on a vast natural network of underground pipes and tunnels.
And as populations increase, there's going to be more and more interaction. You're going to continue seeing sinkholes develop, and some of these sinkholes are being caused by man's activities.
Fortunately, most of us today no longer use sinkholes as trash dumps. Cities are turning sink basins, which flood, into parks rather than housing developments.
We need to be aware of the fact that whatever we do within our own little microcosm, that doesn't just affect us, that affects our neighbors, that affects everybody.
The effect that ammonia pipeline had on the spring was devastating. You don't put a pipeline near a stream.
The pipeline that polluted Maramec Spring was later switched to carry fiber optic cables.
The average person does have a certain amount of control over what happens as far as groundwater quality in these karst areas.
In Ozark homes and farms, many are learning best management practices for protecting our house foundations and keeping groundwater clean. We're installing gutters and downspouts that drain water away from buildings. We're having professionals check sites before building ponds, pools, or houses, or installing a septic tank. Well drillers install deep casings to separate surface water from groundwater. Many landowners are slowing sediment by keeping vegetation in place next to losing streams and sinkholes. And more ranchers are fencing livestock out of these areas.
If they're living in a rural area, if they can make sure that their waste disposal system, whether it's a lagoon or a septic tank and tile field, make sure that it's functioning correctly. If it needs to be pumped, make it pumped out. Basically you keep your waste out of where the water goes down.
Karst is dynamic, ever-changing, and here to stay. Sink basins will still flood, and new sinkholes will appear, whether more wells or springs become polluted, or more houses are at risk. depends on decisions we make now, especially as the Ozarks become more populated.
We can adapt to karst. We can choose our building sites wisely, and we can protect our groundwater so that it's safe to drink and enjoyable to swim and float when it emerges as a spring.